You remember when Moses was bringing the plagues on Egypt, right? And he takes his staff, he hands it to Aaron. Aaron, touch the Nile River and turn it to blood. Why? The Nile River gave him life. And he was not permitted to, because that would have shown ingratitude. That's the primary example. And yet, these private agendas, these historians who have prostituted their academic backgrounds, have caused a grave religious problem for Jews who believe them, because they've robbed us of the ability to show gratitude to the man that saved a large number of Jewish lives. And let that number be academic, how many? We don't know. But we know it was a large number. Sir Martin Gilbert is one of the most prominent historians in the world. And he said he saved at least 200,000 in Hungary by their multiple actions to stop the deportation in Hungary. And so many different historians, people who are alive today, said the actions he took in every one of these countries. How is it you can find the nuncios from each country doing the same thing, giving out false baptismal papers, sheltering Jews in the nunciatures? Every bishop, every priest, they get credit for it, and it stops when it goes to connecting to the Vatican, the source of this. Actually, politically, they have the power to do anything they want. The Pope has no power over them, their political views. The Pope's actual power is only in religious matters. But he would call this as a religious obligation for us to do what we can to save this, and he called it this vital community. This vital community was his terminology. And we had one letter from a woman who actually had an audience with him. She was a Jewish family, Zevi the name was, in 1947. She stayed with her mother, her uncle, 9 of them or something like that. They met with Pius XII in 47 after the war was over. And her uncle looks at him. He says, you were dressed as a monk, and looks at Montini, who's next to him, and you were dressed as a regular priest. You were in the ghetto. You brought me into the Vatican. And then Montini immediately said to him, silence, never repeat that story. The whole notion that the Pope actually went into the Jewish ghetto and brought people in personally. And we know he did that during when Rome was bombed. We saw him left the Vatican and he's standing among the flock. He was a very brave man. And so we have these testimonies. Nothing. We just had a symposium in Paris. We had a very prominently, highly respected history professor from Bologna there, who said, actually made the statement, he says, when I have my students, I refuse to allow them to use documents as evidence. And so one of the other professors turned around and he said, that's the stupidest thing I've ever heard. Certainly. Where are you getting your history from? Right. Waves from heaven? Come on. And that's the problem. This is the problem. But it's an incredible phenomenon how somebody can actually change the way people think, and everybody believes it. It shows you that we've advanced. We're in the 21st century. We're just like little monkeys in a cave. We're no different today. Somebody says something, you believe it. I read it in the New York Times. It must be true. Guess what? It isn't. So it's an issue. It actually started in 2006. And I was the head of the executive director of the New York Board of Rabbis called me and asked me if I can help a Jewish journalist get access in Rome for a book he's writing on Pius XII. And I said to him, look, Rabbi, I hate Pius XII. I don't like him. I don't like what he stood for. I don't like what he did. But I also am working towards bringing Catholics and Jews closer together. I'm not going to contribute to anything that's going to make this another negative book on Pius XII. He said, well, why don't you meet with him? I said, all right, I'll meet with him. This is Dan Kurzman. And Dan Kurzman's book was not on this. This was a book on the actual plot that Hitler ordered to be drawn up to General Karl Wolff to invade the Vatican, kill the entire Roman Curia, and kidnap the Pope and bring him to Liechtenstein where he would have been executed. I said, what are you kidding me? Why would he kill him? He's a Nazi collaborator. He helped him. And Dan Kurzman said, and Dan Kurzman was a very prominent, he passed away, but a very prominent journalist from the Washington Post. He said, Absolutely not true. The exact opposite is the case. They despised each other, and so on. I said, something's wrong here. And so and it actually started even prior to that. It just shows you how providence works. Just before this phone call from the head of the New York Board of Rabbis, Meredith and I were sitting with the nuncio to Israel, the Vatican's ambassador to Israel, for lunch. And he said that Yad Vashem had put a very negative placard about Pius XII in the memorial. They're very, very upset about it. Can Pave the Way Foundation do something about this? And I said, look, I'll look into it. We walked out of that meeting, and I said, why would I want to do something for Pius XII? And so we came home, and I got this call from this rabbi. That was the first step. Somebody was telling me, wait a minute, there's a mistake that's been made here. And then it went on that I got a phone call from the Vatican's ambassador to the United Nations, who said, you should go out and meet with Sister Margherita Marchione. Now, Sister Margherita is a little 91-year-old nun who's feisty, she's brilliant, and she is the one who actually initiated this big fight to clear the name of Pius XII. So I went out there, and she's now showing me documents, and she's showing me letters of testimony, and she's showing me all this stuff. I was dumbfounded. Then I arranged for Sister Margherita to meet with Dan Kurzman. We went out for lunch and everything. She showed him all this. And it just went from one situation to the next where I started discovering the truth, and I said, something's desperately wrong here. So one of the contacts, actually, that Sister Margherita had was with a priest who is retired now, Monsignor Ferrafino, who was in Provence, France. And he's in his, at that time he was 91 years old, and Mary and I said, we really need to, while we're in Europe, go and interview him on camera, which we did. It's on our website now, where he started telling us stories about how he was first a priest in the service of the Pope, directly working with the Pope. And the Pope would send him, for example, to Portugal to request visas for Jews that had to emigrate into Portugal to protect them. And he said that, and Ferrafino said that when I met with the president of Portugal, I could express the words of the Pope, but not the emotion. And in the interview, you see him say this. The Pope would say, he says, we have to get this Americans done. We have to save this vibrant community. And the Pope was very emphatic about this. And so he would go to the president of Portugal, and he would get these visas granted. Then, he was then reassigned. He was no longer working in the Vatican itself. He was made the secretary to the Apostolic Nuncio to Haiti and the Dominican Republic. And he said that his job was then to transport Jews from Portugal into the Dominican Republic and then on to Canada, Mexico, Cuba, and the United States. And he would do so, and he said that they would always try to get transport for these people. And he went over there. He went in the chaplain's cabin. He said there were 800 Jews on that ship and 9 Catholics. I was the chaplain. He went in the chaplain's cabin and went on a World War I ship called the Serra Pinta, went to the Dominican Republic, and he was stationed there. And then every 6 months, from 1939 to 1945, he would get a double encrypted telegram directly from Pius XII. Now, we interviewed him and said, in the interview, he said, well, who would decipher this? He says, I did it. I used to do that in Rome, so I knew the system. There's a code system. He said the telegram would be written in a foreign language, and you'd count the number of letters, and that would give you the key to figure out what it said. And it always said the same thing. They would need, if they could get transport for, say, 791 Jews, he would then have to go to, with the Apostolic Nuncio, to go to the president of Portugal, the president of the Dominican Republic, Trujillo, and say, in the name of Pius XII, we're asking for 791 visas, and they would always be granted. And then the people would come over to the Dominican Republic, and they would be kept in a village there, Sosua, and then they would be moved out. They'd always want to go to the United States, and then he would help move them further to Mexico, Canada, and the United States. And there were numbers of them, numbers of different situations like this. That's as far as the interviews are concerned. Now, we also have newspaper articles. I always found it unusual. Why would everybody hates this guy? He's such a demon, right? Go online and go to the archives of every newspaper, any newspaper you can find, and put the query in 1939 to 1958. Jews, Pope, Pius XII, those are the key words. We have, throughout our work, the work of Pave the Way, and again, this is going on since 2006, we've come across many, many, many Jewish people who were saved directly by the actions of Pius XII and knew it was Pius XII, one of whom, Michael Tellerkozzo, is the chief archivist of the War of Italy in Haifa, Israel, in the Holocaust Memorial in Haifa, Israel. And he is very emphatic about it, that it was Pius XII that saved him. And he was in Rome on the 16th of October, 1943, when the Jews were arrested. And he was taken into St. John Lateran, and the priest hid him. And he said to the priest, he said, "Thank you so much for what you're doing." And the priest said, "Don't thank me, thank Pius XII." And he's also, this guy runs a Holocaust memorial. He's now, I think, 92 years old. But these people are going, we're losing them, which is why we try to capture them if we can. I'll give you the best example of this is that they use the network of the Roman Catholic Church to save Jewish lives. This started when before he was Pope, 1938, November of 1938, Kristallnacht in Germany. There were approximately 200,000 Jews left in Germany right after that. 3 weeks after Kristallnacht, if you go to our website, you can download the original documents that we have, where Pacelli, at that time it was Cardinal Pacelli, wrote to 65 apostolic nuncios and bishops around the world, asking for 200,000 visas, and he called them non-Aryan Italians. They had every code name you can imagine, because the Concordat that was signed with Germany enabled the church to save converted Jews. So they use that all the time as a reason in all their correspondence. They call them non-Aryan Catholics, they call them converted or non-Aryan Jews, all kinds of names rather than Jews directly. However, we have letters that this were now 65. Then we have it 3 weeks later, we have another letter going out to all of them saying that you must not only get visas for these people, you must also be prepared to respect their religious beliefs, their religious precepts, and their religious institutions and books in High Latin. So the Pope would write, first of all, the language of the Vatican is Vaticanese, and you'd have to be a member of the Curia or the political environment to understand what it is they're saying. We had actually one document where the Pope was scolding somebody saying, "You must learn to read between the lines, Father." So we know that this took place. Let us realize something. Many of the historians, or the people who consider themselves historians, they may have high academic degrees today. Let us understand that none of them, literally, have ever served in the armed forces. None of them have ever faced a regime where they could have been walking in the street with an unencrypted phone number in the pocket and somebody take his pistol out and blow his head off. They don't know what that's like. Pius XII and Pacelli, while he was nuncio in Germany, lived on ground zero. He was surrounded by hostile forces. He was infiltrated by spies and still managed to save Jewish lives, which were not part of his flock. But this was his responsibility as a Christian to take care of the roots of Christianity, the Jewish world. And I have to, interestingly enough, there were 16 million Jews just prior to the Holocaust. Today, there are 16 million Jews. The number is just, it's taken us how many years to come back to that number. But it's an incredible phenomenon, and the world, how the world came to change its opinion of him is outrageous. And so I found it very, very unusual, and so I went online, as I encourage everybody to do the same thing. Go to whatever city you're in. Go to the archives of their newspapers, 1939 to 1958, Jews, Pope, Pius XII, those are your key words. I found hundreds of articles, not one negative article. Not one. Now, how is this possible? It's possible because we were manipulated. And personally, I have taken the position, I took the position, I cannot sit silently by and just let this happen. This is a Jewish issue. It's not a Catholic issue. This is robbing the Jewish people of gratitude, expressing gratitude to the man that did save their lives. And this is a sin in Judaism. The worst character flaw you can have as a Jew is ingratitude. And so this is why it's such a very important issue. And people attack me and they call me every name, and I couldn't care less. I know precisely what I'm doing and why I'm doing it. And trust me, throughout the entire movement of this work, up until this day, this is, so many years we're working on this now, my wife and I have watched providential events occur which just advance this one step further and another step further. It's like we paved the way, our path is being made by the boss. That's who I work for. And it's just one thing to the next. So I can get attacked by monkeys and all these other idiots who call themselves historians, and trust me, they have prostituted their academic degrees. I found that outrageous. And they put themselves in a situation where they say, well, I have a PhD and I'm the distinguished ecclesiastical professor from Harvard or whatever, or Cornell, or I'm smarter than you. I know better. You're not scientific. You're not scholarly. Well, guess what? My answer to that, I'm a juror. I sit on a jury. I don't have all of this. I don't have an agenda here. I'm looking at evidence. Here's my evidence on my website now, 76,000 pages of documents, eyewitnesses, newspaper accounts, government documentation. Show me your evidence. Show me anything. No, they can't. It's fluff and vapor and crap. And that's the thing that's so insulting, because we're sitting here and taking it. And it's not just the Pius XII issue. This is just one example of how governments and people who want to manipulate your thinking are doing so. We have, and the best example of this is that there are distinguished PhDs and professors in some countries that deny that the temple ever existed. They deny that there were ever Jews in Israel. They deny this. And yet, well, I'm PhD, I'm professor, diddly squat from Monkey University. That's what I said, so you should believe me. But what did you just do? You just took and insulted every true academic and every true historian by prostituting yourselves for your political agenda. And that's very sad, very sad. We get manipulated to do virtually everything, and everything impacting us today is happening the same way. Yeah, well, this is, well, it started with Pius XII, and the Russians started with Stalin. Stalin despised him because he opposed him. The fact is that we have documentation from the United States with the American ambassador to the Holy See asking, with the British and the Americans corresponding, saying, we must encourage the Pope not to speak out against what's going on with the Nazis. Why? Because they knew they would have to speak out against the atrocities committed by the Russians. And he knew that would hurt the Allied cause. And so they encouraged him not to speak out, which he complied with. But again, he despised the notion of communism, and he despised the notion of godless countries. And so he was the enemy, the supreme enemy, plus the fact that members of the Russian Orthodox Church also despised the Roman Catholic Church. And so this was a mechanism that was being able to be used, and again, moving us like little sheep, and it was very strategic the way this happened. It's just the most remarkable thing, and the fact, I would never have believed this, say, 12 years ago. The fact is, I watched it happen with this one situation with Pius XII. We're also watching it happen today with Israel and Iran and all of the powers in the Middle East. People have manipulated. The media is manipulated and manipulating. And so this is a very, very serious issue because, you may sell newspapers by creating a story that's a wild, exciting stories or something. But what's your bottom line? You're going to make money? What good is your money if you're dead? What good is money if you've created an atomic event, international atomic event, which will end all life on the planet? What good is that? And that's what they're pushing to. I mean, who's going to win then? We have to come to the point that we must put a stop to this manipulative ability to mold minds, and it happens to all of us. And there are people that are trained doing this. The same agency that worked for the KGB is working today with the FSB. I mean, didn't you find it unusual that Stalin is a hero of the country and that people, parades and everything else? He dies, he's immediately an enemy. They changed the names of all the cities that possessed. They did the same thing with Khrushchev and Brezhnev and everybody else. They build them up, they knock them out. Doesn't anybody find that unusual? They did the same thing with Pius XII. He's a hero, now he's hated. Exactly the same thing. And this is the problem with the disinformation network that's going on. We are manipulated. But the problem is now we're getting to the point that we don't no longer have sticks and stones. We have weapons of mass destruction. And you're putting it in the hands of people who are lunatics, who really have no compunction, especially those who think that they're doing it in the name of God. That's something to pave the way. Our ultimate goal is removing that agenda from religion. You know, and they make fun of this too. A lot of people say, "Oh yeah, you Americans with your communist conspiracy theories and everything." Well, guess what? You're pushing an agenda. As far as I'm concerned, all of the media, almost nobody can be trusted. We're actually starting a project with Pave with high school and college students, where they're going to actually take a story, and we're going to send them a group of students to investigate, and we're going to videotape it. So you just sit and watch the story. Here's how it was reported in the New York Times. And here's what the kids found out when they went to this country. You know, you'll see something like, just a few weeks ago, in Israel, it snowed. We had some heavy snow, and some Arabs were throwing snowballs at 2 Hasidic Jews. It was world news. You're just making this absolutely worse. And that's the sad part about it. And it's unfortunately something that if we don't do something about it, it's just going to ultimately cause our demise as a people, the world. And we need to be able to recognize that and start working towards the well-being of people, and not them, just trying to manipulate things so that, the elite few get what they want. If you go into some of the territories, you say Palestinian people have been abused by everybody, and they're wonderful people. And Muslims are wonderful people, but they've been manipulated just like everybody else is, and they take their love of God and misdirect it for their private agenda, to enrich themselves. Where they consider it an honor, and they honor those who've committed suicide and have murdered innocent people. There were countries that do this. This is outrageous. Islam forbids it, and yet you have religious leaders who stand up there and make these speeches, kill Americans, kill Jews, kill. No, kill nobody. And forced conversion is not conversion. People who convert to a faith because they believe in it is one thing, but by the threat of annihilation or death, it's not conversion. And so this is a phenomenon we face as a people. There's 6 billion people on the planet. Future's not that bright for them, because you have this minority. I call it the tail that wags the dog. And our enemies, the enemies of peace, Muslims are not the enemies of peace, Jews are not the enemies of peace, and Christians are not. Jewish extremists are the enemies of Jews, Christian extremists are the enemies of Christians, and Muslim extremists are the enemies of Muslims. And it's up to each faith to deal with those, to cut them off, cut off their funding, cut off everything, if you want to put an end to it, and let people live their lives. Because that's really what everybody wants. It's a misinterpretation. It's a manipulation of what the Quran really says. And I can also tell you, just to give you an example, one of our projects is with the Greek Orthodox Church. We're trying to help the Greek Church, the highest authority being the Patriarch of Constantinople, to reopen a seminary which was closed by Turkey in 1971. So we actually have a large group of Muslims from around the world that joined in a letter to the Prime Minister, which I sent last May. A few weeks later, July 5th, the highest, and in this letter, the Muslim leaders called for the reopening of the Halki Seminary in the name of Islam. This is what it said, based on a document which I have. It's on my website. The document exists today. You know what the document is? It was written in 600 and, I can't remember the date, 628 or something, with a handprint of Muhammad. Muhammad could not write. He was illiterate. And yet he'd sign things with his handprint. Document says that he calls upon all his followers until the end of time to protect the Christians, to protect their churches. They are good people. They are modest people. They are people of the book, as Jews are, and orders them until the end of time to protect them. Do you think anybody knows this document exists? When I brought it up with our local newspaper here on Long Island, sent it to the religious editor of Long Island, you think it was worth printing? No, nothing. Silence. We have the mosques many of the mosques protesting the illegal use of their religion, putting out press releases condemning these actions. And, well, you think anybody, is the Times writing about that? No. So they're a party to this. Because I think that ultimately the cause of more deaths throughout human history is the media and historians who distort true history for an agenda. Again, this document doesn't deal with the Jews except with a reference to people in the book. I think that was the essence of what it is we're saying is that the Islamic faith does not permit this. And I think you'll find many, many Muslim leaders that agree with me that these people have, and these are the true people who insult Islam. Somebody who commits suicide in the name of Islam is the true insult to Islam and Muhammad, the teaching of Muhammad. And this is a very, very important issue. So they'll blame somebody who does a cartoon. People die because they did a cartoon in the Netherlands about Muhammad. And yet, when somebody commits suicide or a massive bombings, Shiites killing Sunni and Sunni killing Shiites, they blowing bomb, this is happening all over the world. That's not an insult to Islam? Of course it is. And it's up to Muslims to stop it in the name of Islam. So this is why it's such a critical issue. We have the same thing in Judaism. And we have the same thing in Christianity. We have these extremists that carry an agenda forward, and that's the most important thing. I'm sorry. They have, and I'll tell you what, actually, they just had one of the historians, the so-called historians from Australia, brought him to New York and did a lecture, put it on their website. I downloaded the entire thing because it's completely deceived. It changed things we've said. Just as an example, this particular individual said that our organization's German representative was a very incredible researcher who was at the Vatican Secret Archives regularly, Michael Hesseman. He said, gets up and he says, can you imagine Michael Hesseman said that Pacelli saved 200,000 Jews just after Kristallnacht? Doesn't that sound strange? Oh, sure does sound strange. He didn't save 200,000 Jews. He tried to save 200. There's a big difference there. And yet he uses this as an example. So what we're going to do, ultimately, if I get angry enough, is I'm taking his lecture and everything he said, now pasting in the response, and then putting it on the website. So the whole world will see it. When you respond to this guy in Australia, by the way, on his blog, he never prints the response. Never. He completely denies everything. For example, in the same thing, he states that October 16th, 1943, that the Italians asked the Germans to stop the arrest of the Jews. Absolutely not true, because I have the documents from the commanding general of the governorship of Rome, General Rainer Stahel, who was responding to the Vatican's call through Bishop Hudal, who was the Pope sent his nephew to meet with this Nazi-sympathizing bishop. The Pope didn't like this man, but he knew that he had influence. So he sends his nephew, Carlo Pacelli, to warn this bishop that if the arrest of the Jews does not stop, that his Pope is going to speak out vehemently against the Germans. And the generals were petrified of that because they knew Hitler would order the invasion of the Vatican, which was previously planned. They all knew this was happening. And so he sent his nephew to meet with Hudal. Hudal writes the letter. The letter's on my website with his signature, addressed to General Stahel, saying this, and also saying, well, you never know, General, that you may need the Vatican one day, you should do this. Stahel then telephones Himmler, Heinrich Himmler, and gives him a military excuse why these arrests must stop. What he said was that, he said, the partisans are picking us off at night. The Allies have full air superiority during the daytime. And you're expecting me to take my troops to supply the war effort down south, fighting in the south of Italy. I can take the 384 troops you want for me to arrest the 8,000 Roman Jews. But you will assume responsibility for this. Himmler, not being a military man, acted on it and called for a cessation of the arrest. Now, how do we also know what happened? During the investigation of the canonization investigation done by the relator in the High Court, the High Judge of the Vatican, they telephoned a General Dietrich Belitz, who was the liaison in Hitler's office, between the different commands. And he would always listen in on telephone calls. He heard the phone call from Himmler from General Stahel to Himmler. You heard the phone. So we know that this happened. Immediately, Himmler orders that the arrest stop at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. And yet, this historian from Australia said, the Italians didn't want him to stop, so they stopped arresting him. Really? Do you have documentation to prove that? Do you have anything to prove that? No, you don't. This is what stopped it. So what I'm going to do, the reason we had it downloaded is because if they know what we may do on this thing, then we're going to take it off the internet. But I have it now permanently archived. So we can now edit in what he said and then patch in Professor Rishlag or Michael Hesseman responding to it, where he's correcting what he said, because he's misleading everybody. It's outrageous. It's outrageous. This is just another example of somebody, and they use him all the time. And the worst part about it is that in this particular interview, he states, well, the ADL got me my publisher, helped me make the connections, they're selling his books. There's an agenda there. So that's usually, and by the way, many of the Jewish, and by the way, some of the most prominent rabbis in the world now agree with me, and so does Yad Vashem actually changed that placard. I don't know if you're aware of that. July 1st, they changed the placard. So that's changing things. Ultimately, he's going to be looking like an idiot, and I'm just a poor country boy from Long Beach, New York. I'm going to be the one who's saying, wait a minute, I pointed this out. Everyone's going to remember that. I have no problem with that. So they can do anything they want. They have their agenda. Their agenda and their motives are different than mine. I work for the boss. I don't think they do. They work for the bank, or whoever else. I don't know who they're trying to serve, but it's not the well-being of the Jewish people, for sure. And many of the Jewish leaders I speak to all over the world say, if they hate you, it's a badge of honor. I have the same obstacles many people have dealing with the Vatican. However, because I'm trusted, I've asked, for example, the Vatican published in 1981 11 volumes because Pope Paul VI ordered 3 Jesuits to go through the Vatican secret archives, which during the war years, to pull out all diplomatic documents, not private or personal documents, just official diplomatic documents, and pull out anything pertinent to this issue. And they brought out 9,000 articles. And that was, it's called the Acts and Documents of the Holy See during the Second World War. And so what happened was the Vatican then, they published this, but in order to see it, you had to buy it, €200 from the Vatican, and so on. That's the only way you could see these. And they gave them out to a few different institutions, but you have to go through page by page. I went to the Secretary of State and said, can I digitize these and put them on my website? Yes. And it's on my website and the Vatican website. We digitized the Acts of the Holy See, which is everything, all of the speeches, everything else from 1909 to 1961. That's on our website. We also have every newspaper article written in L'Osservatore Romano, 1938 to 1945, on our website. So any researcher, any historian can go in. I'm not asking people to believe my theory, but ask for something more than some opinion with an agenda. My agenda is very clear, and it's something I did not want to get into, I can assure you, but it's something by just conscience I had to do, and that's why we continue doing what we're doing. So when I'm attacked and many Catholics too, because a lot of these Jewish causes, they cite Catholics. These are left-wing Catholics that hate their church for whatever reason, and they use this as a reason to attack it. And so they turn against us. I find, believe it or not, by and large, the majority of the Jewish people I speak to, and I speak to Hasidic temples and Orthodox, most people have said, I'm really happy to hear that. I believe that. People my age remember him. He was Pope when I was born, and I remember him. My uncle, Stanley Finkel, who just passed away, was in the Navy, met him 2 times where the Pope gave him a medal, and he told me how wonderful he was. And I have all of the evidence we have of how every Jewish agency, the Anti-Defamation League itself, has articles about how he was saving Jews during the war. It's the most outrageous thing. The Jewish Telegraph Agency, to this day, is the main news source for the Jewish world. Articles all over the place about how he's interceded here, he's interceded there. The B'nai B'rith, 1940. B'nai B'rith magazine, May of 1940. Pius XII's Pacelli's picture. No, it's Pius XII's picture. It's on the front cover. And with the article, the Pope's Jewish Scholars. What is that about? As the Italians were firing Jews for the racial reasons, racial laws, he was hiring them in the Vatican. So they did a whole article about this. What happened to change it? I have things between them. The American Jewish Committee has got a 1957 audience with Pius XII. And in the documents which talk about what he was doing, the fact that they were getting prepared for this. It was just an internal document. It said that talking about how he saved all the Jews and he was considered the Jewish Pope. All these things during the war. It acknowledges it. We have things in a Jewish telegraph agency in Lyon, France, where the Nazi commander goes to the Archbishop, "We will leave the church alone if you remain silent on the Jews." And the Archbishop says, "As our Pope has said, we are vehemently against your anti-Jewish and anti-Semitic policy." And the Nazi leader left. This is in the Jewish Telegraph Agency in 1941. Now tell me what happened to change all this. What happened is you have people who have financial goals, financial reasons to stir people up and make a lot of money. And that's all it is. We don't make a lot of money. The Vatican does not sign concordats with friendly nations. For example, there's no concordat with the United States and the Vatican, never was. All the friendly nations. The Vatican only signs this with adversarial relationships. And what it does is set forth the rights of the church within that country. Hitler offered them a concordat, which was take it or leave it. The church is now looking at this, and they have to protect the Jews of Germany, the Catholics of Germany. And the concordat was very generous in many, many respects, but there were clauses in it, for example, on Jewish marriage and marriage with Catholics, where the Catholic Church said that we believe Judaism is a religion, not a race, and that any Jew who converts to Christianity is considered a Christian. And the Germans signed that. That's why they were able to do all their correspondence, but they would never refer to them as Jews. They refer to them as non-Aryan Catholics, converted Italians, every name you can imagine. And so it was a necessity. It's something they had to do. And the fact is that Pacelli really didn't even want to, but he knew he had to sign this. But actually, because of that clause, they were able to save tens of thousands of Jews by giving them false baptismal papers. That's what made that viable. And so it was a necessity that they do that. 30 days before it was actually approved by the Vatican, 30 days before, the Jews of Palestine signed a concordat with the Nazi government. And this was in terms of bringing Jewish immigration from Palestine and what the terms were going to be. Are you telling me that the Jews of Palestine recognize the Nazi regime? This is the worst part, is that they say that they recognize the Nazi regime. No, they didn't do that. They had a diplomatic relations with Germany, as they did with Tokyo. In fact, they saved a lot of Jews, sending them to Shanghai in China through the apostolic delegate in Tokyo. And so they have these relationships. Doesn't mean they recognize them. And in fact, something that most Catholics don't know is that in 1930, the German bishops excommunicated anybody who joined the Nazi party, who flew the flag, and who wore the uniform. The Concordat forced them to lift that ban. Why? Because the Nazi party was now the legally elected government, and it's against canon law to do that. So what they did was lifted the ban, but they never stopped criticizing it, because I have all of the records up to 1938 teaching Catholic institutions how they're to treat the evils of National Socialism and Nazi regimes. And so everything falls according to an order. And if you look at this, it's a huge picture, and just very current now. And I pointed this out, that this is completely unknown to most people. But Pope Benedict is resigning on the 28th of this month. 70 years ago, a letter of resignation was written. On September 6th, 1943, Pius XII resigned his papacy, put the letter in his desk. Why? They fully expected to be invaded. This is in the letters of Tardini. It's not been published. It can't be opened. It's part of the sealed section, checking off the names of every cardinal present, where the Pope said, we're going to be invaded, and I'm going to be kidnapped and taken. It's taken out of the game. But when they take me out, they'll take Eugenio Pacelli out, not Pius XII, because my resignation is in my desk. And you're all instructed to leave Rome immediately as somebody enters Vatican territory to go to Portugal, where you will set up a government in exile, and they would elect a new pope in Portugal. But the fact is that when we talk about, I have begged every one of these critics, show me something. Show me anything. For example, if you read one of the books, Susan Zuccotti's book on Beneath His Very Windows, there's two parts in it. It's in my it's in our new book. She talks about, first of all, how there were 57 Jews in the Vatican on a certain date, and that this is quoting a letter of Cardinal Canali, who was the governor of the Vatican State, who was not particularly a friend of the Jews or anybody else, where it's demanding that we throw the refugees out of the Vatican. Why? Because one of the churches had been invaded by the Nazis, and they were afraid it would happen to the Vatican. And so this is proof that they wouldn't protect the Jews. No, it's proof that Canali didn't want him out. But the fact is, had you followed that up and found out what really happened, he telephones Pius XII. The Pope is on the phone. Yes, Eminenza, si, click. Nothing happened. And then he makes a statement, nobody's going to be forced to leave the Vatican who doesn't want to. Everyone's free to leave if they wish, but nobody will be forced. And in fact, there were situations where they brought kosher butchers in to feed these people. There were people, if you go to the Vatican today, their names, Jewish names, are on the mailboxes where they stayed. Still there. So that's one thing. Then she interviews a fellow by the name of Aldo Brunacci. Monsignor Brunacci is a priest in Assisi. His bishop, Niccolini, who was made righteous among nations by Yad Vashem, has Aldo Brunacci's on one side of the desk, the bishop's here, and he holds up a letter. He says, I have here a letter from the Holy Father asking us to do everything possible to help the Jews. And Brunacci acknowledges, yes, we will do what we can and everything. Understand that these letters were ordered to be destroyed because they were very specific. And that's why they don't exist today. There may yet be one someplace that may be uncovered in one of the dioceses. So Susan Zuccotti actually said, well, did you read the letter? He said, no. The bishop was on the other side. I was here. He says, but you never actually saw the signature or anything. And he may have been deceiving you to try to get them to save the Jews. And he laughed. He said, no, don't be ridiculous. Of course not. That's what she printed in the book. There's no proof. That's not proof. You understand? How people will take what they do is they come up with a theory and then figure out a way to prove it. That's what this guy in Australia did. He wrote his book, and he's selling tons of it because every time we have a little tumbling on the internet, people buy your books, especially when it's being promoted by a nice Jewish organization. They buy your books. But all it does is it just makes things worse. You're robbing the Jewish people of their God-given right to dignity and gratitude, to express gratitude to a hero who did save their lives when nobody else would do anything. Nobody did anything in Washington. Roosevelt did nothing from the safety of Washington. Churchill, by comparison, did nothing from the safety of London. What did the Archbishop of Canterbury do? What did the Orthodox churches do by comparison? This man is in ground zero in Rome, surrounded by hostile forces, infiltrated by spies. The Vatican had approximately 1,300 people that work there. They will live around Rome. The Nazis were trying to get them to spy on what was going on. We have, for example, the Valkyrie attempt on Hitler's life, 1944. We have the documents of the Kaltenbrunner report. I went to Germany. Mary and I went to Germany. We got the Kaltenbrunner report. It names Pacelli and his secretary Lieber as co-conspirators. Why? Because they were. They actually said that they would not interfere to negotiate a peace unless Hitler was dead, essentially, or out of office. And so they actually planned some of these things in the scavi, in the basement of the Vatican, so nobody would hear it. They would have to do these things. So we have so many different examples of intervention and things that happen by anybody who's been through a war, who's lived through this, who knows what it's like. They don't sit in some nice little cushy classroom and guess what it's like. They've experienced it. And so when you fashion words to come up with a theory, you're doing it based on life's experience. None of these people have this life experience. Literally none of them serve in the armed forces. You don't see historians today who've been in the Army of the United States or any other nations who've actually been in combat, who actually have seen this, who actually see death and killing and desecration of human life. They have no experience. And so this is the person who you're listening to on how he should have acted? No, I don't buy it. And you know what? I'm right, they're wrong, I know it, he knows it, and it's going to be proven. And every single day, this effort that we started, and we actually did internationally in 2008 with our symposium, we addressed Pope Benedict, saying, this is the shocking information we discovered. The Pope's addressed back to us at Castel Gandolfo, again, said exactly the same thing. That started the big uproar. That's when we're attacked by everybody. I did an op-ed piece for the New York, the Daily News and for the New York Post and stuff. So the ADL came out, front page of the New York Times, attacking me because this is against their policy. Let me tell you how this has worked. I'm not recognized as anything because I'm not a scholar. The way it's done is simply that Yad Vashem is an honorable institution that is very simply analyzing stuff that's becoming available. As we would find documents, any documents that are very pertinent, I would email them to the Apostolic Nuncio in Israel. He would then hand-deliver them to Yad Vashem. This has been going on since 2007, 2008. So they're getting that, plus the fact that they are new information is coming. They just came out with a book recently on the new documentation on Pius XII. And so they're now easing their stand on it because based on information they're receiving, they can make this statement. Before, they were basing it on criticisms by who they consider historians. And so now they're starting to realize they're going to do the right thing because they were criticized by it, by some Jewish communities criticized them for it. But they're doing what they need to do because they are a scholarly institution that wants to do things right. And so that's why it's going, but they don't recognize me, they don't recognize what we're doing. They may do, on the table may say, yeah, this is where it's coming from, but I'm not a scholar and I'm not a historian, and I say I'm not. I'm a juror. I'm somebody who takes evidence and I look at it and I come up with a conclusion. That's all I am. Nothing special. I'm like everybody else. This system works throughout the civilized world where we have trial by jury. If we could take Pius XII to court, I don't care who prosecutes this, and you look at evidence, we win. Hands down, we win. But the fact is that the critics will not face the defenders. They did recently. We helped sponsor an event in the Sorbonne in Paris because when they criticized me of being not scholarly, we encouraged the Sorbonne and one of the most prominent historians in the world. I said, we'll help you with this. We'll help sponsor it, which we did. And here, the critics actually face the defendants. And that's where the one guy said, we don't take documents for evidence. Another one said, how can we use scraps of, he actually said, how can we use scraps of documentation it's dangerous to use scraps of documentation to declare history. You're using no documentation to create history. Yours is based on fuzz that you think you're getting from waves from heaven. I don't know where you think you're getting it from. But you come up with a theory, and that's where you're doing this. This is wrong. It's just plain wrong. And the fact is people die because of perceived history. And more people are killed by this. And that's why we can't sit quietly and just let it happen. And I don't intend to. I don't care what names you call me. I don't have a reputation for a scholar to defend. I don't care what they say. I'm right. I know I'm right. I have one of the most prominent rabbis in the world as a friend who I brought this to. I spoke to him before I started this. And I said, Rabbi, I have to tell you what I found. And he said, I want to see everything you find. So we actually had our book, the first book translated to Hebrew, and he's looking through it, and he actually said, thank you for opening my eyes. I said, Rabbi, say nothing publicly, because you'll be criticized, and you don't need this. Let them attack me. You stay out of it. But the fact that you're telling me that I'm right, that's enough for me. I don't need to have the AD or anybody else approve of what I do. I don't approve of what they do or how they do it or their mechanism, because some of these different organizations have outlived their usefulness. I mean, it's just, just an example. The ADL is supposed to be preventing anti-Semitism and combating anti-Semitism by Foxman's own words. I mean, I have his fundraising appeal, which I get all the time. He said, in my 45 years with the Anti-Defamation League, anti-Semitism is the worst in human history today. What does that tell you about how well you're doing your job? What does that tell you about your mission? Whatever it is you're doing that you're spending your $70 million a year on, it ain't working. Time to change a little bit, because yes, indeed, we are suffering the worst anti-Semitism in human history, far worse than World War II. Because we don't have just some Christians that hate us. This is now 1 billion Muslims. You know, they're trying to convince 1 billion Muslims who don't want to be convinced, by the way. And the fact is that, you can't condemn Islam for this. You know, only certain leaders, just like the same thing. So it's a important issue that we need to deal with.